Hi, this is David McCann for WebTNG. This video I'm talking about System Font Stack and what that is, why you might want to use it, and how to use it. In this video I'll be using bricks for showing the examples, but the principles are the same no matter if you're using Gutenberg, a page builder, or are coding by hand. But first, this video is brought to you by WP CodeBox, the smarter way to create and manage code snippets in WordPress. With WP CodeBox, you can write PHP, JS, CSS, and more, save it to your cloud, and reuse it on every site without extra plugins. It's got cloud storage, WordPress autocomplete, a condition builder, and even lets you package snippets into standalone plugins. Whether you build one site or 100, WP CodeBox keeps your workflow clean and your site secure. Try WP CodeBox today and code smarter in WordPress. For the sake of this video, let's divide fonts that are used on a website into three categories. First are system fonts. System fonts are pre-installed on a user's device, and they are the default font on a user's device. The obvious advantage of system fonts is they don't have to be downloaded, so there is a performance benefit. Second category of fonts are web-safe fonts. These are fonts that are also already installed on the user's device, but they may or may not be the default system font. Like the system fonts, because they're pre-installed, you have that performance advantage. And the third category are web fonts. These are the type of font you're probably most familiar with using, like Google Fonts. Web fonts have to be downloaded to the user's machine, to the user's device. You can do that by hosting the fonts locally and referencing them in your style sheets, or you can have a link to them and the user's browser can download them from Google or some other source. Generally these days, the first option is thought to be better, to host them locally for the sake of GDPR. Okay, so what makes a font stack? In CSS, there is a typography declaration called font family. Here is an example of it. You have font family : and then the name of the font, and generally it's considered best practice to put the font name in quotes if there are spaces, sometimes even for special letters. And you can actually have more than one font in the list by putting a comma between the fonts. Conceptually, think of it as a quote-unquote stack, because if you have, say, 3 or 4 fonts in the list before your generic font family name, think of it that as a stack where you begin with the first one. The browser sees if it's installed and if the glyphs or characters in the font file cover, support what the web page has on it. If it does, then that's a match, and that's the font that's chosen. And so you work down the list, and that's where you get the stack metaphor, I guess. Okay, at the end, it's best practice to include the generic font family name. And this is a list of the generic font families: serif and sans serif. Serif fonts are the ones that have tiny little decorations on the letters. Sans serif are the ones, sans meaning without that extra decoration. Okay, then there are monospace, cursive, fantasy, system UI, UI serif, UI sans serif, UI monospace, UI rounded, emoji math, and Fang Song. Of interest to us, system UI, that is a CSS. It's not an actual font. That's a CSS declaration or designation saying we're referring to the default system font. Okay, so that's the most modern way to refer to the system font. Let's go look at can I use, and this system UI as a designation for the system font. We see it's available globally for more than 95% of web browsers. It's baseline and it's supported by everything except for IE and Opera Mini. So it's pretty safe to use these days. If the CSS generic font type property system UI has baseline, you may be wondering, why do you still need to specify a full font stack? And the reason why is because even though it's widely supported by modern browsers, there's still a large number of older browsers and older devices that don't know what it is and won't recognize it, and so will ignore it. So to cover those cases, it's considered best practice to go ahead and also add in a full font stack. System fonts are used by a number of popular websites today. For example, if we go to WordPress and we go into the admin, I'm just going to use the Hoverify extension here to look at the CSS. Okay, and you see where it says System UI, and then we go down a little bit to the CSS and we see Font Family dash Apple System. That is an older designation by Apple of the default Apple system font. Then System UI, that's the one we were just looking at. Then Sego UI is the default font on Windows. Roboto, default font on Android. Oxygen, Sans, Ubuntu, Cantarell are default fonts on Linux systems. And then Helvetica Neue is a font that's been around for a long time and is pretty widely installed. And then finally we get to our generic font family, sans serif. Now, interesting note that virtually all of the system fonts are sans serif fonts. There are a few that are monospace fonts, for example, for an editor context or maybe for a console device. Those tend to use monospace fonts. All right, so there's dear old WordPress using a system font stack for the admin. If we keep going and we look at some popular websites, here for example is Reddit, and if we take a look at what font is here for Reddit, we see System UI, and here is their font family, very similar to the WordPress admin. They're listing some emoji fonts also so that they have consistent emojis. Okay, then we go to the Weather Channel. We see that is using IBM Plex Sans as the first font in their list. That's the system font on IBM systems. Then they have the Seagate UI, which is Windows, Roboto, Android, Oxygen, Ubuntu, Cantarell, Fire Sans, Droid Sans, Helvetica Neue, very popular on Mac systems and Windows systems, and then sans serif. Okay, so that's their system font stack. If we go to booking.com and we look at what their fonts are, they are using System UI and then Apple System, Seagate UI, Roboto, Helvetica, Arial, sans serif. One more. This is the National Institute of Health, Library of Medicine, a big government resource website, and they are using System UI with a similar system font stack. Apple System, Seagate UI, Roboto, Oxygen, Ubuntu, Cantarell, Fira Sans, Droid Sans, Helvetica New, and sans serif. You can see that there are big websites that are using it. The disadvantage of using a system font stack is usually because of branding. You don't have control of the font that's used in branding when you use a system font stack. But the value of looking at a bunch of examples is that you can see that websites can still use a system font stack and have a nice design. But I do think that people who use a system font stack are probably leaning towards the utilitarian side. They want something that's going to be very performant. Okay, so that's a look at some websites that are using System Font Stack. Let's go now to test website, and I'm going to go into the Bricks Builder. And what we see here is that I've installed a bunch of fonts onto this Bricks install. And if we go and look at the typography settings here, you see that for each row, I set the font as listed here. So you can see the similarities and differences. These are popular ones that are system fonts. I think Cantarell is a default font on Linux systems that are using the GNOME desktop, and Noto Sans for ones using KDE desktop. And then we have these two, which have been around a long time, and then Deja Vu Sans, which is, I think, maybe the most installed on Linux. For what it's worth, as far as I understand, Arial was been around for a long time, was popular in print. Helvetica was designed to be kind of a web version. And Liberation Sans was designed for Linux systems because there was a licensing requirement for Arial. So that's how it gets its name. So most of these are common system fonts, and a couple of these are ones that we saw in those font stack declarations. The variation here is in the space between the letters and also in the font weight, the default font weight. They're all set for 400 as a font weight, but you can see that variation. So if you're using a system font stack, you can kind of take this into account, maybe know that the fonts are going to look very similar, but the spacing might be slightly different, and that might play a role in the order that you set your fonts. One other thing to note here, if we look at the font typography here, there's nothing set for font family. That is the default. I'm on a Mac, so you see I haven't set any font family for this row, and so we will go see what that looks like on the front end. But you're not actually able to reference San Francisco Pro on a Mac, which I think may be where that Apple system font declaration name comes from, because they're licensed and Apple doesn't let you use them directly. Let's go to the front end, and we'll use the Hoverify item here. If we go and we look at this row, here it's got System UI. We can see that Bricks is using this System Font Stack by default. And if you're creating, say, a blueprint site and you use different fonts on different builds for clients, you can just leave it blank and it's going to use the system font. And then when you do your build, you can upload a font and set it. Okay, so that's the default font on Mac, which I think will be the San Francisco font. Here we can see this is Deja Vu Sans, Liberation Sans, Roboto, Sego UI. All right, now if we want to reference a font family stack in Bricks, how do we do that? Okay, so if we look at, this is Bricks 2.0, the way you set them is you go into your theme styles and typography, and if you go to body and font family. Now there's a oddity with Bricks in that you can only pick one, item in the list. You can't make a font family like you can do when you're writing the CSS by hand. So I tried a little hack or idea. I'm using the Advanced Themer CSS framework, but you could use whatever CSS framework you're using. And I added a CSS variable for font family, and I set the font family here, the list here, and my idea was that I was going to go into the font family area here, and I would just reference my variable, and that would be the way I'd get around this limitation of just being able to choose one font. And I found that while I can enter a variable name there, it won't save. I'm hitting the enter key or return key, and it won't save. So that doesn't work. And the way, I guess, to define in Bricks a default font family is that we go back. There has been added now a site-wide style sheet, and so we can put our font family declaration in the style sheet, and I've got that here. So you can set your font stack, your font family this way. Just for the sake of experimentation, let's put Helvetica New first. Okay, and save. I want to go to the front end of the site, not to this page where I've set the fonts, but just to the home page. And we'll use this inspector, and we'll see there it's defaulted to Helvetica New. All right, so that's the first one that it found on my computer that had all the glyphs that it needed. At this point, you might be asking the question, what's the right syntax? What system font stack? What list of fonts should I be using? So to answer that question, first let's take a look at the system font stack examples that we reviewed, and then I'll share what I've chosen to be my system font stack, which I think is optimal, and I'll share why I think that is. So let's look at this list of the examples. Weather.com is a little bit of an outlier because it has the IBM Plex Sans, their IBM mainframe system font listed. It also does not have the Apple system or System UI options in there, which if you look at Reddit, Booking.com, PubMed, and WordPress admin, they all have that. Now, another thing to notice is that Reddit and WordPress have Apple system first and System UI second, whereas Booking.com and PubMed have it the other way around. But they all have Seagate UI, they all have Roboto, and they all have Helvetica New. And then a lot of them have Arial, and then we have several different options for different Linux systems. I want to show you what I chose and explain that. But before we go on to the next slide, take a look at the System UI syntax that Reddit, Booking.com, PubMed, and WordPress admin have. You notice that it's in double quotes. And if you look at a large number of sites, big sites all over the internet, you'll find that it's in double quotes. However, if we look at the documentation on the Mozilla Developer Network, you'll see that it explicitly says it should not be quoted. And if you go and look at the CSS working papers for the CSS spec, they allow for things like System UI to be in double quotes, but when it is, there should actually be a font named that on the system. So they allow double quotes for those odd cases where someone creates a font using what would normally be a reserved word. When you put it in double quotes, the browser is supposed to ignore it if there's not a font, an actual font on the machine with that name, which means that in many websites, they've done System UI wrong and it's being ignored. Kind of hard to believe that a huge percentage of websites is doing it wrong, but this could be the cardinal sin of copy-paste. All right, so now this is what I came up with as the quote-unquote optimal system font stack. Apple system first, and current Apple devices will understand System UI, but old ones won't. And Apple System was a designation created by Apple to say use the Apple System font. So that will catch older Apple devices. Then System UI, not in double quotes, should tell pretty much every modern browser, go ahead and use the system font. Then we have Seagate UI for Windows. We have Roboto for Android. We have Noto Sans for the KDE desktop. Cantorel for the GNOME desktop. And then we have Deja Vu Sans, which I think is the most common font installed on Linux computers. All right, then Helvetica New, which is all over the place on Mac and Windows. Then Arial, which is on every Windows machine since Windows 3.1. And then the generic fallback sans serif. All right, so that's my system font stack. You'll notice I didn't add the emojis. If you're using emojis, you might want to add those. But I'm curious what your takeaway from this is and what your system font stack would be. All right, that's my look at using a system font stack, what, why, and how. I hope you found the video interesting and useful. If you did, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching.